everyone. So I am still really sick with the flu, at least at the time that I filmed this video. I don't know when I'm going to upload it, but I was kind of tired, but I still wanted to do a video, so I decided today it might be fun to look at one of my old sketchbooks. This is not my oldest sketchbook, but it is pretty old. I believe I started working on this sketchbook about 6 or 7 years ago. I'm not positive. Some of these I may have dates for, and if I do, I'll put the date up on the screen. I know I'll have a date for these first ones here in just a second, but yes. So let's get into my old sketchbook. Okay, so my first sketch here was actually for a Pokemon themed RPG that I started years ago. And it's kind of sad because I don't think I ever actually started it. So I got all of the prep work done and I did drawings like this for every single person who was in it, but then I never actually started it. So this is me with Lapras, which is my favorite Pokemon. And then this was supposed to be another drawing. I think it was Friends characters. I don't remember what that was for. Chibi head designs. This was just, I think, a normal commission for somebody, but they were also in the Pokemon RPG. They just didn't want a Pokemon in the background. I still really like this little mermaid chibi. I think it's really cute. I think after a point with this, I just started putting my tallies for stuff in here to make sure that I did everything correctly. If I was doing large things, like this was for, I think, the 30-day Monster Girl Challenge, which is in this book, by the way. I'd like to redo that at some point, but this is a drawing of my mom, which is kind of funny. Then another Pokemon character. I did her character here, and then I did the Pokemon separate. That was a really good online friend of mine that I have, or had. We don't talk very much anymore, which is kind of sad. This was a friend of mine. Again, Pokemon drawing. This is actually my writing partner because she was also in that RPG, which is kind of funny. So, yeah. Some concept hair for that drawing so that she could decide what she wanted. Another friend of mine. This was supposed to be a commission for a friend, but then I ended up doing it in a different sketchbook. This was for, I guess it was like the professor character in the RPG, but we never got there. So I actually fully colored all of these. I just did it digitally because I did digital art at the time. So it's sad because I did most of the work and then I didn't even do it. Another Pokemon RPG member. I actually still think this one's pretty cute. Another Pokemon RPG member character. This was supposed to be another Pokemon RPG character, but I was having so many problems with it, I just did it in another book. This was my gym badge, and I actually did finish this. It's on my computer somewhere. I don't know if I'll be able to find it before I film this video, but if I can find it, I'll show you. Again, I messed this one up, so I think I did it on another page here. A lot of what I did when I was younger is I would just get halfway, because these were supposed to be for this and I only finished this one, so I would leave a floating head and then I wouldn't do anything more. I attempted to draw Pokemon, didn't like it, so I just crossed it out. This was for that last commission and I'm still friends with this person. Go and check her out here on DeviantArt. Another one, I just decided since it was going to be symmetrical, I'll just copy it. Same person, because she, I don't think actually was a part of that Pokemon RPG, but she had me do her and all of her Pokemon that were in her team. So that was fun. These are more Pokemon that were in her team. Another drawing of me with Lapras, which I just love Lapras. I think it's so cute. Floating head, which was supposed to be a Pokemon. I don't remember who this was for. It might not have been for anybody. Ah, so this might date this because this is a wrecking ball joke. So she came in like a hairball. Okay, so floating head. This was a drawing of 2 of my characters from one of my first books that I actually worked on, and unfortunately I just never went back and finished it. And this actually was a drawing that I still think is pretty good, considering that I had like just barely started drawing, because this book I had only been maybe drawing for a year or two at the time. And I still actually kind of like this one. I would like to redo this in my current style because I still kind of like the movement and stuff. And I actually still really like this anime drawing as well. This was done for that same friend here, and I just loved her character. So she's in a few of my books. And this was, I think, oh, this was my Monster Girl daily tally, and I just covered up a drawing that I didn't like. So here is essentially all of the Monster Girl drawings, and I'm so irritated because I did actually almost complete this challenge, but I ended up having some issues because my old cat had like an abscess in her mouth, and I needed to take her to the vet, and it was a whole couple of day thing because she was sick for a few days afterwards, and so I ended up just not being able to finish what I was doing. And this was a lame slime joke where it says something like, "I look terrible in bathing suits." No, you look good. So, yeah. I'm actually sad that I never finished this one because like it's not up to what I do now, but I still think that it's kind of a neat idea. I like the piano keys flying everywhere. Also, sorry, my voice is kind of going out a little bit. And like most of these ended up having digital versions that ended up being pretty cool. Like I liked this one, and I liked the Harpy earlier. This one was also pretty cool, but I just didn't have any use for them, so I sold them off as adoptables, and I think I did finally end up giving away all of these characters except for the ones that weren't finished. Yeah, some of these, it's all essentially the same thing, so I'm just gonna flip through. This was from The Fifth Element because it was supposed to be an alien, and I was like, but you know what alien I liked? And this, actually, I have to say, I either would like to redraw this one, or I would actually just like to finish this one, because I still think that it's kind of neat. So some of this, it's kind of nice to flip through sometimes and go through what you've originally made, because you may find stuff that you'd like to give another go at. Because I did enjoy actually doing this Monster Girl challenge. I feel like I could do a much better job now that I'm older and a little bit better at things like anatomy. And I believe she's supposed to be cosplaying as Twilight Sparkle. It's kind of funny. Yeah. And this one also came out actually pretty cool digitally. I may or may not try and actually put the digital ones that I have up so you can see what they ended up being. Just depends on how lazy I'm feeling. What is kind of funny though is I feel like when I first started out with these, I actually had better anatomy and stuff, and then at some point I feel like it sort of went downhill, and I don't know if it was because I stopped trying as much. Oh, and this right here, this is when I ended up not being able to finish the Monster Girl challenge, so this is what I posted to tell everybody. I used pastels and they bled everywhere. And this is a drawing of my sheep. And all these drawings with me with the goggles on, that was kind of like my persona at the time. And I actually do have steampunk goggles like that. I might try and show a picture, but yeah. And I still actually think this is a pretty good drawing of a cat, again, considering I had just gotten started at this point. And this was actually a more recent drawing. This was about 3 years after all the other stuff that I've shown to this point, and this is fan art of Death Jr., the root of evil. It's Pandora as an adult. Also, I'm sorry about the drill sound in the background. There's nothing I can do about it. So of course, right when I start filming, it's been quiet all day. Another drawing of myself. I think I did this for an avatar. And this was kind of a funny request because somebody just asked me to draw my characters in boxing clothes. And it was funny because I did this and I like completed the whole picture and then they just never commented about it. So kind of weird. This was my attempt at realism years ago. This was another character of mine, and I had done her on a base that I was trying to make because at the time I was like, yeah, I'm gonna make one of those like online doll maker games. And so I did that and I actually got pretty far. I have some of the illustrations in here, but most of them were in another book. But yeah, I still like these pants and her little moth dragon. This was another one. These were supposed to be clothes for that dress-up game, and I think she was also turned into a character at one point, but I never got back to it. More for the dress-up game, which is why there are so many weird parts on it that don't really make sense. More for the dress-up game, different kinds of like underwear, I think. More for the dress-up game. Tails for the dress-up game, which I still like this fin design. I've actually used that in other places. That one I just never got back to. This was a drawing of one of my characters. Let me see if I can turn it around without losing where I am. One of my characters, actually that super old character from my first story. And that was my first attempt at drawing her. And these are, again, for the dress-up game. Let me make sure everything still in frame. Okay. And I still actually like parts of these. It was kind of fun drawing just smaller details like that. I think it helped me figure out clothing structure. So that was kind of interesting. And pants and bottoms for the dress-up game. So yeah, I still like these cargo pants actually. So a kind of species that I have, again, from my main fantasy world. These are chibi body practices, and I actually still very much draw my chibis like this. It's just like a tiny little bit better, but I like this kind of chibi design. It works for me. This is supposed to be a page of boys. I only did him, and actually I think I ended up finishing him and making art for one of my really good friends. Yeah, if that's there, it'll be there. And this was a contest entry. I don't actually remember what place I ended up taking. I know I placed. I don't think that I got first, but this was actually pretty cool. I think I'll put a picture up of it here if I can find it, but yeah. So that is one of my older sketchbook tours. It's not my oldest sketchbook tour. I would like to actually go back in and do my oldest sketchbook tour again, and as well as a few other books that I have been working in for years. I also actually want to do some recent sketchbook tours because I have a lot of artwork that I haven't shown or posted anywhere that is actually pretty good and pretty neat. So hopefully at some point I can get around to doing that. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and I'm sorry that I was kind of like quiet and breathless because I am still sick. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.